Hey everyone, how's it going? I just wanted to make an updated video about this camera, the Hasselblad 907 X50C. I made another YouTube video you're welcome to check out, and I posted a ton of sample RAW files and sample fully edited images over on my Patreon, which is where I share a lot more of my insights like this. But I've owned and used this camera for about, I don't know, like 4 months now. I found it to consistently be just fantastic joy to use. But I do have a few follow-up notes. One, highly recommend the grip. This grip took a little bit longer to ship. I forgot what the model number and the name of it is, but it just gives you this really amazing sort of joystick driving or like almost like you're piloting a craft of some kind experience, and you get to customize the buttons a lot more than what they let you do with the buttons on camera. I just find when I'm shooting and I have the screen popped out and I'm kind of shooting, you know, from the waist to the hip, this is a really nice grip to have. I do think they could have been a little bit smarter in how they laid out the design, especially since they seem to be working from the assumption that you're shooting from the hip. They could have made this maybe able to pivot at a different angle or just, I don't know, rearrange some of the things, but the grip is well worth it. And they also sell this other accessory, this optical viewfinder, which is totally way overpriced, not worth it at all. But the thing I like about it is that this comes with a little metal mount to hold anything you might want to put in a cold shoe, like a flash trigger or something like that, which I've used a few times. Now, the biggest surprise to me in owning this camera was playing around with all the different mount adapters. And doubly surprising was the mount adapter that I tended to love the most was the Nikon F mount adapter. And that's only because I own this really old, beautiful lens, and this lens is the 58mm f1.2. So it's an incredibly shallow depth of field, just a giant aperture lens. To my surprise, when I actually popped this thing on the mount, on the Hasselblad, this lens was actually so over-engineered back in, I think, the 1970s when they made it, that it has edge-to-edge coverage across the whole frame with no noticeable or super problematic vignetting. There's a little bit of darkening, but it's hardly a problem. Here, I'll actually take a picture right now of a white sheet that I've got in front of me. When shooting at f1.2, the vignette is really not that big a deal. So that's at 1.2. Let's stop it down to f16. So no vignette at all as far as I can tell. Now the special thing about this combination, this lens that was built for a 35mm film camera mounted to the larger sensor of this medium format Hasselblad, this 58mm lens, which again was built for a 35mm film size frame, when mounted to the larger sensor size of the medium format Hasselblad, it's got quite a large sensor in there. Because it covers edge to edge with no need to crop in camera, you get a full mathematical equivalent, roughly, of a 46mm f0.9 lens. If that lens was able to be manufactured and mounted to your full frame camera, that's what this equivalent perspective is yielding. 46mm f0.9. So that's a pretty wide field of view with an incredibly shallow depth of field. It's a lens that doesn't exist at all, to my knowledge, without doing some sort of bokeh panorama or something. So you're able to get a, what I consider a true medium format look with this combination. Unfortunately, there is a catch, and there's always a catch, but I'm actually really optimistic about the future iterations of these medium format cameras combined with this type of lens specifically. The catch is you have to use what they call the electronic shutter, which essentially just keeps the shutter open and then scans the sensor really quickly. And the problem is that that scan occurs in a very slow amount of time. I can't remember the exact equivalent, but I think it's about 1/3 of a second. So you can imagine if you were shooting with your shutter open for about 1/3 of a second, how limiting that could be in the subjects that you're photographing. You're going to get motion blur if you move too much or if what you're photographing moves too much. However, if you're doing portrait work and you're able to coach, your subject into being still just for a brief moment, or if you're doing any type of still life or landscapes or anything like that, it's not a problem. You can reasonably hold this handheld, take the photo, and you're done. But it is a limitation to be aware of. It is something that I have a feeling future sensors will solve. I can't imagine that scanning of the sensor for the electronic shutter not getting faster in future iterations, but it's unlikely to be something they could ever update over firmware, and that's just unfortunate. But the thing is, this is a manual focus only lens anyway. So I was already working backwards in terms of like a slower, more disciplined approach to shooting, and I've just found it to be a really lovely combination combination. I actually went all in with a lot of Hasselblad lenses, including a very expensive $1,000 adapter that they refused to let me return. Kind of annoyed about that, but whatever. I purchased 2 or 3 of their other native mount lenses to this camera, and they perform great. They look really nice. The 80mm f1.9 has autofocus. You do get the fast shutter sync of a flash. It's great, but strangely, at the end of the day, I keep coming back to this Nikon f1.2 58mm lens. It is expensive. They don't make them anymore. You can only really get them in the used aftermarket. They definitely run about $3,000, unfortunately, but what a fantastic combination I found this to be. I have links in the description of this video that will take you to more sample pictures other than what I'm going to show here. And yeah, if you're the type of person that's looking for a true medium format look in the digital world, this is the closest thing I've been able to come up with that also is relatively easy to use with very few constraints. Unfortunately, I'm not using it for my actual professional wedding work at all. It's just too slow to keep up with a wedding day. It just looks awesome. And that alone can be enough of a reason to own certain pieces of equipment. I notice when I have a subject in front of me and I take this camera out to photograph them, they tend to get a little bit more engaged in the process of what I'm doing. It's very similar to what I think a lot of film photographers exploit. And using a lot of vintage gear, your subject feels a little bit more, I think, a part of the creative process and have a little more patience for what you're trying to do and are willing to let you just do a little bit more, especially if you're shooting film because it's very limited, or a camera like this that looks like film. Anyway, that's my follow-up video. I'd be curious if anybody else that owns this camera or maybe one of the other medium format digital cameras, if they've combined it with any older lenses or newer lenses that yield a similar perspective. Again, the fact that this thing gives me a 46mm f0.9 perspective really makes this such a winner in my book. Also, one other thing to note is the adapter I'm using is the Fotodiox Pro Nikon adapter, and it's got this awesome little grip that you're supposed to mount it to a tripod or something like that, but it works really, really well to just have this nice beefy grip for your fingers if you don't have the Hasselblad grip adapter. Even with it, it's still really nice and sturdy. So highly recommend this combination. Let me know if you have any questions at all. As always, thank you so much for your attention, and I'll be back soon. Bye.